Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 22, Section 4, The End of the Cold War. Before we kind of get into this, when Ronald Reagan was president, kind of in the late 1980s, one of the things that he had been doing is kind of challenging the leaders of the Soviet Union to open up and perhaps maybe even, as he would quote, tear down this wall in Berlin. And by the time we get to 1988, maybe some of that is in the works. So when Ronald Reagan left office in 1988, Americans wanted a continuation of his domestic policies. They were asking for lower taxes. They were wanting less government action, meaning more deregulation, within the world of business. And so what ends up happening is Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, is going to run for president in 1988. And George H.W. Bush easily defeats his opponent, a man named Michael Dukakis, who you see pictured there kind of sitting in the gunner's position on a tank. Dukakis had been the governor of the state of Massachusetts. And the deal was he was portrayed as being too liberal and also a little soft on crime. There was a fellow named Willie Thornton who had been a man who had been convicted of murder in the state of Massachusetts. And he had been, for the most part, granted release, pardoned from his crime by Governor Dukakis. Within a matter of a short period of time, Willie Thornton is back in jail on a charge of murder. And some people are looking at Dukakis and his pardon as being kind of wimpy on the whole crime issue. And in a way, kind of making George H.W. Bush look very strong. So when we look at the election itself, if you take a look at the map that's kind of in the lower left-hand corner, George H.W. Bush won a pretty good portion of the United States. He won pretty much New England, with the exception of the state of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York. He also won upper Midwest, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the far northwest of the United States. But otherwise, everything else went to George W. Bush. And many Americans just kind of thought that he would be Reagan II. So to save his country's economy, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev instituted something known as perestroika. Perestroika was a restructuring that would also allow some private enterprise so that we could have kind of the beginnings of a free market economy. Gorbachev wrote down his philosophy in a book called Perestroika. And I have to admit, it was probably one of the best-selling books here in the United States when it came out in the mid-1980s. I remember even my dad had a copy of that. What's interesting about Gorbachev is that here in the United States, he was a really popular figure. A lot of people saw him as the great hope of really being the guy who was going to end the Cold War because of some of the things that he was instituting in the Soviet Union at the time. Letter D, he also instituted something known as glasnost. Glasnost was this idea of openness, which would allow for more freedom of religion and speech, to allow people to discuss politics in the open. So, for example, if you were living in the Soviet Union during the time of, let's say, Joseph Stalin, a lot of the churches pretty much had to go underground because the communist government was kind of like an atheistic state. But when Gorbachev comes around, we're now going to start seeing these churches kind of come back into the open. And so people are going to be able to worship freely again. But what's interesting is, we have a generation or two that has never been exposed to the teachings of Christ. And so that's going to be a little harder for that to catch on. When we talk about freedom of speech, if you had anything that you didn't like to say about the government, you probably didn't say it during the time of Joseph Stalin, or you probably would have ended up in a gulag and probably never seeing the light of day. But with Gorbachev, now people could actually openly debate the policies of the Soviet Union. And it was really the first time that these people could do so without worrying about being arrested. So, in a way, this was kind of like coming into the light, in a sense, for a lot of the people who lived in the Soviet Union. And in a way, maybe this is kind of the beginnings of the end of communism in that country. Letter A, when we talk about this new world order, in May of 1989, the Chinese government crushed a student protest in Tiananmen Square, which is in Beijing. It's kind of like the Mall of Washington in Beijing, causing the United States and several European countries to halt arms sales and to reduce their diplomatic contacts with China and the World Bank. Also, suspended some of the loans that they had been making to China. What was happening in Tiananmen Square was really kind of happening throughout the world. We just got done talking about glasnost and the Soviet Union and this openness. And what these young students were hoping for in China was kind of like the Chinese government maybe adopting a policy of glasnost, allowing them to openly talk and debate. And so we have a group of students in May of basically 1989 that show up at Tiananmen Square, and they make a kind of their own kind of Statue of Liberty or their Goddess of Liberty, hoping that maybe the Chinese government would, kind of see their demands. What ends up happening is the Chinese government isn't going to meet their demands, and they send out the army to break it up. And what you see pictured below is Tank Man, who was one of our demonstrators, who obviously halted a line of tanks. We never have learned the identity of this guy, but a lot of people presume that he was arrested by the secret police in China, and he was probably interrogated and eventually executed for his doings. Many of these people who were involved in this movement ended up in jail. So it was a real harsh reality. As far as like opening up economics, China does eventually kind of adopt some of the ideas of perestroika, this idea of maybe looking at free enterprise. And so China has made a lot of money in recent years, but there are still lots and lots of restrictions when you talk about freedom of speech. And today, the government still cracks down on those who openly oppose the government. In letter B, in August of 1990, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein sent his army to invade the oil-rich country of Kuwait, its neighbor, and ultimately causing a coalition force of the United Nations to launch what is called Operation Desert Storm. Hussein basically thought that the Kuwaitis were drilling too much oil. The oil reserve that is under Kuwait also is partially under Iraq, and because of the fact that he was a strong-minded dictator, he thought he had possession of the Kuwaiti oil as well. And eventually, the United Nations is going to call for a coalition to basically get the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. And truth is, we met that objective in 1991, but Saddam Hussein survived and would be with us until 2003. Roman numeral 3, domestic challenges. President Bush had inherited a growing deficit under Ronald Reagan, and our economy started slowing down in the late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. And eventually, when we get into 1991, as the Persian Gulf War kind of comes to an end, we enter into a recession. And what we find is that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be laid off or find themselves unemployed. And it was really kind of a real dicey term for our president. And as a result, something he said back in 1988 comes back to haunt him about 1991. In letter B, shortly after taking office, Bush made a decision to improve the economy by basically using what we call a capital gains tax. Capital gains tax is a tax that you use on inheritance. And when Bush was campaigning in 88, he basically was telling the voters, read my lips, no new taxes. But as a result of some of the things happening with the slowing economy, he raises taxes. And that turns a lot of voters against him. Matter of fact, in 1992, when he runs for reelection, the Democrats basically use that as a soundbite in pretty much all their commercials against Bush. And Bush will lose that election as a result of that. So, speaking of 1992, the Democrats that year nominated a man named Bill Clinton to be their candidate. At the same time, our Republican Party is kind of splitting. It's kind of fracturing. And there's a man who runs as an independent, as kind of a reformed candidate, and his name was H. Ross Perot. H. Ross Perot was probably a far conservative Republican. But what ends up happening is Perot running and Bush running at the same time splits our Republican Party. And what ends up happening is our Democrats are going to get the upper hand. In letter B, Bill Clinton was the first person from the baby boomers to enter the White House. And if you take a look at the map in the middle, all the states that are red were states that voted for George W. Bush, H.W. Bush. And that would basically be, kind of the Midwest, including Nebraska. But everything else that's blue, kind of your Northeast, your Rust Belt, the far West, primarily those states all went for Bill Clinton. Thank you very much.